Bonjour, good evening, esteemed colleagues, members of the press, defenders of human rights, those tuning in online from their homes across the globe, and special welcome to our speakers, Vice President of the European Parliament, Katarina Barley, Head of the Human Rights Division at the European External Action Service, Ellis Mathews, UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Professor Nazila Ghaneh, Congressman Jared Huffman, member of the U.S. House of Representatives and co-founder of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, and Mubarak Bala, former president of the Nigerian Humanist Association and the author of the foreword of this year's report. Welcome to the Brussels Press Club. I'm Maggie Ardiente, president of Humanists International. We represent millions of humanists from 130 member organizations in over 60 countries around the world. It is an honor to be with you here today to launch the 14th edition of our Freedom of Thought report. Since its inception in 2012, which I had the great privilege of being involved in through my leadership at the American Humanist Association in Washington, D.C., the Freedom of Thought report has served as a unique and vital barometer for human rights. It is the only global report specifically dedicated to tracking the systemic discrimination, legal persecution, and social marginalization faced by humanists, atheists, and the non-religious across the globe. To understand why this report matters, we must understand the importance of good, rigorous research on religious and belief groups. In global human rights monitoring, the belief component, specifically non-religious beliefs, is too often left out. But data drives policy. We cannot protect what we do not accurately measure. By mapping where blasphemy laws are enforced, where apostasy is punishable by death, and where secular voices are violently silenced, this research shines a light on some of the world's most forgotten minorities. We take the findings of this report directly to the United Nations, to regional human rights bodies, and to national governments. Crucially, the report empowers our advocacy and the advocacy of our members, who are at the heart of all that we do and at the forefront of contexts where freedom of religion or belief is under threat. There's a very deliberate reason we chose to launch this report here in Brussels. As the political heart of the European Union, Brussels is a vital hub for international diplomacy and a beacon for democratic values. The decisions made in this city ripple across the globe. But today, those values are facing a serious threat. The theme of this year's report couldn't be more timely: the right to freedom of religion or belief in a world of rising authoritarianism. Globally, we are witnessing an alarming trend: the weaponization of the very language of religious freedom by illiberal state and non-state actors. They are using it not as a shield to protect the vulnerable, but as a sword to attack others. They invoke it to justify rolling back women's reproductive rights, to criminalize the LGBTQ+ community, and to silence secular dissent. We must firmly reject this and reclaim the right to freedom of religion or belief, or FORB. The basis for a truly inclusive vision of FORB, as enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is that it protects the individual, not the dogma. It protects the human right to hold a religion, to change your religion, to criticize a religion, or to hold no religion at all. A genuine inclusive vision of FORB inherently recognizes the non-religious, and it categorically refuses to let human rights be misused to justify bigotry or oppression. This brings me to the importance of the European Union in this endeavor. The EU possesses the diplomatic leverage, the established 2013 FORB guidelines, and the moral imperative to champion this inclusive vision on the world stage. We look to the EU, through its special envoy, its external action service, and its parliament, to lead by example. We urge the EU to ensure that its human rights diplomacy explicitly includes the non-religious, and to stand as a bulwark against those who seek to distort FORB for authoritarian ends. Merci and thank you. Now, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Vice President of the European Parliament and the representative for secularism and humanism on the board of the German Social Democratic Party. Please welcome Katarina Barley.
Thank you so much for the invitation. The list of the people I'm supposed to greet now by name is, I think, half as long as the people who are so I would just say hello to everyone and say that I'm very happy to be here. You said it. I'm responsible in my party for the questions of humanism and secularity. Is that yes? Can I put that? And I have made the experience myself that it is even in a progressive party not easy to lay the ground for a to have this form of organization equally to those of religious beliefs, and this in a 160-year-old party that only included a religious connotation very late in its history. So I have all the respect for your work, and I'm very glad to be here. Although I can't stay till the end, I say that right away. So distinguished guests, before there is speech, there is thought, and before there is choice, there is conscience. Before there is action, there is conviction. And in exactly this inner space where individuals reflect, question, and decide lies the starting point of every democratic society. Freedom of religion or belief protects precisely this sphere of autonomy. It guarantees the right to adopt a religion, to change it, or to live without any religious affiliation. It protects believers, humanists, atheists, everyone who believes in whatever God, and those who have chosen not to believe in any God alike. It is not a marginal concern. It is a cornerstone of democracy. And this depends on citizens who can think freely before they speak, who can form convictions before they vote, who can act according to conscience without fear. And where inner freedom is protected, pluralism flourishes. Where it is restricted, democratic culture and human rights begin to erode. And erosion is precisely what we are witnessing at the moment, at a global stage in a lot of countries and in a lot of respects. Across the globe, freedom of thought, belief and non-belief is increasingly constrained. These restrictions do not arise only through formal prohibitions. They also emerge through the instrumentalization of tradition and identity, through social pressure, through political narratives, and through laws that privilege certain worldviews while marginalizing or even criminalizing others. This development is part of a broader democratic decline. The Freedom of Thought report documents this trend clearly. An overwhelming majority of both the states that were only observed by Humanists International in 2025 and those that were re-evaluated as part of the rotating updates fail to fully respect the rights of non-religious people and religious minorities. Discrimination, blasphemy laws, and unequal treatment before the law are not isolated anomalies. They are symptoms of weakened democratic safeguards. The pattern is global, even if its manifestations differ. In some contexts, repression is explicit and absolute. In countries like Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan, freedom of thought is curtailed through severe criminal sanctions. In Afghanistan, under Taliban rule, apostasy and blasphemy can be punished by death. There is no meaningful space for dissent. Non-belief must be hidden to survive. In Iran, accusations such as enmity against God are used against religious minorities, political descendants, and secular advocates. Political criticism is reframed as theological betrayal. Dissent becomes heresy. In Pakistan, blasphemy laws carry the death penalty, and even unproven accusations can trigger mob violence. The mere allegation can endanger a life. A democracy cannot function where discussing religion is legally and socially endangering. In other countries, repression is more subtle, but no less consequential. Bangladesh constitutionally affirms secularism as a fundamental principle, yet Islam is declared the state religion, and broad blasphemy provisions restrict expression. India's constitution is secular, yet rising Hindu nationalist rhetoric has coincided with violence against rationalists and increased pressure on civil society. Formal guarantees endure, but the political climate chills dissent. Nepal, once a Hindu kingdom and now a secular republic, continues to grapple with penal provisions that criminalize religious offenses. A reminder that constitutional language alone does not automatically secure freedom in practice. In Malaysia and Sudan, the report identifies grave violations or at least severe discrimination across all 4 categories assessed in the report. Malaysia has seen increasing religious conservatism, expanded Sharia-based policies, and restrictions on media and civil liberties. Sudan, devastated by civil laws and stalled reforms, remains a context in which minorities and dissenters are highly vulnerable, despite earlier attempts at liberalization. Now I have to make a little break because it's quite daring to put this country in the same line as the ones before. But I've worked very closely on Hungary, and Hungary represents a related but distinct pattern, of course, within this broader landscape. Rather than overt legal repression on belief, the shift occurs through the symbolic and institutional privileging of a particular religious cultural identity. Hungary's political leadership has framed its project around the defense of so-called Christian culture, strengthening the fusion of national identity, religion, and state policy. Democratic backsliding there has not primarily occurred through the abolition of elections, but through the gradual narrowing of who truly belongs within the political and social community. And finally, Russia fits into this pattern in a more intricate way. While its historical relationship to religion has been shaped by decades of promoted atheism, current developments, including the criminalization of opposition related to the war in Ukraine, the banning or labeling of independent religious and civic groups as extremists, the marginalization of non-religious individuals in a climate that increasingly privileges traditional values, the so-called, and the growing public role of the Russian Orthodox Church in legitimizing state policy. They all illustrate how belief and state authority can nonetheless become mutually reinforcing within an increasingly authoritarian framework. Russia has intensified its authoritarian trajectory, particularly since 2022. Independent media and civil society actors have faced severe repression, justified as a defense of traditional values and national security. Close alignment between state power and dominant religious institutions reinforce a narrative in which criticism of the prevailing order is portrayed as moral subversion. We also must acknowledge even established democracies are not immune to new pressures affecting their core principles. In the United States, developments under the second presidency of Donald Trump have sparked severe concerns about an intensified alignment between government policy and conservative Christian nationalist agendas. Broad interpretations of religious freedom have been advanced in ways that may allow religious exemptions to override civil rights protections in areas such as education, healthcare, and LGBTIQ rights, and of course, women's rights. These debates illustrate that democratic erosion does not always arrive abruptly. It can unfold within existing democratic institutional frameworks. Across these diverse contexts, the pattern remains consistent. When governments ground political legitimacy in a dominant religious identity, dissenting beliefs become suspect. When pluralism is portrayed as weakness and uniformity as strength, freedom of thought is reframed as a threat rather than a right. Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights protects theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs equally. It safeguards the inner forum, the realm of conscience I mentioned at the beginning, which must remain beyond the reach of the state. When that boundary is crossed, other rights soon follow. If a government can dictate what a citizen may believe, it can dictate what they may say. It can punish peaceful criticism of religion. It can punish peaceful criticism of power. The connection between democracy and freedom of thought is not abstract. It is structural. The countries with the worst records on freedom of thought are often those with the most severe human rights violations overall. This is no coincidence. When thought is criminalized, no other freedom remains secure for long. Democratic decline does not always announce itself dramatically. It often arrives wrapped in the language of tradition, national identity, moral order, social harmony, family tradition. But democracy demands something more demanding, the willingness to protect even those views that challenge majority belief, including the choice to live without religion. And when that protection weakens, it is rarely society as a whole that feels the consequences first and most severely. Restrictions on freedom of religion or belief tend to fall the hardest on those who are already vulnerable. It is always the women and girls who face discrimination when it comes to their reproductive rights, particularly in access to abortion. Restrictions or bans prevent them from making autonomous decisions about their own bodies and life plans. And it is very disturbing to see this in a country like the US unfolding in the way it does. It is also often the women and girls who are subjected to restriction on dress codes and mobility, limitations on educational and professional opportunities justified through religious doctrine. In several of the contexts mentioned, child marriage, unequal inheritance rules, and gender-based violence are reinforced by appeals to tradition. LGBTIQ individuals are frequently targeted when governments invoke traditional values to consolidate political power. In some countries, same-sex relationships are criminalized. In others, social hostility is encouraged through official rhetoric. Sexual and gender minorities are portrayed as threats to moral order or to national identity, and their exclusion becomes a political instrument. These patterns are not accidental. When the state claims authority over conscience, it reshapes the hierarchy of belonging. Those who conform to the dominant identity are protected. Those who differ in belief, in gender, in sexuality are exposed. Defending freedom of thought, therefore, is not and should be regarded by no one as a niche concern. It is not about privileging irreligion, non-religion, humanism, secularism over religion. It is about preserving the boundary between state power and individual conscience. It is about ensuring that citizenship never depends on creed and that equal protection is not contingent on conformity. I would like to take this opportunity again to thank everyone involved in compiling this report. Through sustained research, as you said it, and documentation, it brings these patterns into public view and provides an essential instrument for accountability and democratic reflection also within the parliaments. Democracy does not die only when parliaments are dissolved or constitutions suspended. It dies when citizens learn that certain thoughts are better left unspoken. And the defense of democracy begins with a simple principle. Thoughts are free. belief or non-belief is a personal decision protected as a human right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katarina, for those very helpful opening remarks. Good evening, everybody. I'm Gary McClelland, the Chief Executive of Humanists International. It's so nice to see so many of you here today in Brussels, and welcome to the many people following us online all around the world. Very shortly, I'm going to give you an overview of some of this year's results and findings from the Freedom of Thought report. But before we do that, we're going to hear from two people who can't be with us in person today, but wanted to share their thoughts at this important event. We're going to hear first from Nazila Ghania, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. And then afterwards, we're going to hear from US Congressman Jared Huffman, one of the co-founders of the US Congressional Free Thought Caucus. So we should have those video messages now.
Ladies and gentlemen, I regret not being able to join you in person for the launch of the Key Countries edition of the Freedom of Thought report today, but I am pleased to at least be able to share this recording with you. The Freedom of Thought report fills an important gap in our understanding of this human right, and the Key Countries edition provides details that cannot be found elsewhere, captured in such detail, yet succinctly in such a user-friendly way. I'd like to congratulate the report's editor, Nick Bull, and of course Humanists International for this launch. 40 years after the creation of the Freedom of Religion or Belief mandate, 10th of March 2026 being the exact anniversary, and 45 years after the adoption of the 1981 UN Declaration on all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief, and we still have to recall and repeat that freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief is definitely and deeply concerned with the rights, legal status, discrimination, and violations against humanists, atheists, agnostics, freethinkers, and the non-religious. Whether in its biannual thematic reports, its country visits, its communications, or continued and varied engagements, this fact is integrated and integral to the work of this mandate, but also to the concerns of all genuine freedom of religion or belief advocates. It cannot be otherwise. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights and subsequently the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights recognize freedom of religion or belief as having various aspects. There is the right to have, adopt, and change one's religion or belief. And though it was met with some opposition, the right to change one's religion or belief was included explicitly in the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and is understood to logically follow from the right to have or adopt a religion or belief as stated in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The UN Human Rights Committee, which oversees the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, authoritatively stated in its 1993 General Comment 22 that religion or belief is to be construed broadly and is to include theistic, non-theistic, and atheistic beliefs, as well as the right to profess no religion or belief. It also protects diversity of thought, of interpretation and practice within religion or belief communities. And such diversity has played such a fundamental role in enriching human thought. As we know only too well, we are talking about both the freedom to believe and the freedom not to believe, the freedom to identify with a religion or not to do so, the freedom, whatever freedom the conscience leads one to, whatever belief one's conscience leads one to. This allows us the possibility of being true to our conscience. As Maggie Ardiente, president of Humanists International, states in the preface, you are more than your non-belief, and of course should be entitled to the enjoyment of all human rights and equal dignity. This conscience aspect of freedom of religion or belief is sometimes referred to as the forum internum, and it is clear from our normative architecture that it cannot be subject to any legitimate restrictions under any circumstances, not even in situations of war or other kinds of emergency. It follows that coercion of any kind that would impair the forum internum is also prohibited. Then there is also what is sometimes referred to as the forum externum, or the right to individually or collectively manifest one's belief or religion. This aspect of the right is not absolute and can be subject to limitations insofar as they are established in law, proportional, absolutely necessary, pursuant to a legitimate aim, and non-discriminatory. Here, the right to freedom of religion or belief interfaces and overlaps with a broad range of other rights, such as the right to equality and non-discrimination, to freedom of expression, of peaceful assembly and association, the rights to health and education, other socioeconomic rights, and other rights. And the report details so many of these violations and infringements in the 20 countries it covers. The report's alarming observation is that global freedom has declined for 19 consecutive years, and indeed that decline seems to be speeding up rapidly. There might be time to draw attention to a few more general principles. We've already captured the interrelatedness and indivisibility of rights. And freedom of religion or belief should therefore be understood and not seen as contradictory to, but inherent to other rights, including equality, opinion, expression, non-discrimination. The goal, therefore, is not so much as to resolve conflicting rights, but as Heiner Bielefeld would always say in the mandate, to identifying a practical concordance of rights with the protection of the inherent dignity of the human person or collective as its central objective. A second important principle to remind ourselves of is that freedom of religion or belief does not protect beliefs or ideas or even conscience in and of themselves. It protects people and their liberty to have, change, and manifest those ideas in the full enjoyment of their human rights, including their personal integrity and security. Freedom of religion or belief, understood as a human right, therefore strengthens the realization of other human rights, including all of those which promote healthier democracies. In the opening of this 61st session of the UN Human Rights Council and the 20th anniversary session of the Council, High Commissioner Volker Turk yesterday reminded us that human rights are not political currency and they are not up for grabs. Our future depends on our joint commitment to defend every person's rights, every time, everywhere. It is when freedom of religion or belief is abused as a selective or exclusive political platform that violations of human rights multiply, as they do in the persistence of blasphemy and apostasy laws in many countries, violating legitimate exercise of freedoms of thought, conscience, opinion, expression, and others. Just a few of the cases that this mandate has raised in its communications include that of academic and atheist Mr. Junaid Hafiz, the author Salman Rushdie, the atheist and freedom of religion or belief activist Mr. Muhammad Rostam Mojtabba, and Mubarak Bala, who we are all relieved to see free. So thank you for all the work that goes on behind the scenes to survey, document, report, and draw attention to the discrimination and persecution you painstakingly draw attention to in all of your work, including in this report. And thank you for your contribution to advancing freedom of religion or belief for everyone in a dispassionate way.
Hi, everyone. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman. I'm sorry I couldn't join you in person this year, but I appreciate the chance to say a few words of solidarity. As a fellow humanist, the only one officially to ever serve in the United States Congress. And that's mainly because at the time of our nation's founding, our modern definition of humanist didn't exist. And so many of our great founders who were inspired by Enlightenment ideals, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, Paine, and others, identified as deists and rationalists, but we can confidently say that they were also humanists. And even today, many of my colleagues in Congress check all the boxes for being a humanist. They just haven't yet embraced that label for their worldview. All of that is just to say that we humanists have a lot of support in the founding ideals of this country and in the ongoing work of many principled members of Congress. And at a dark and challenging time like this, when democracy and the basic right to freely think for yourself is under attack by religious extremism, we need the moral and intellectual clarity of humanism more than ever. I want to specifically thank you for your latest Freedom of Thought report that highlights these threats in the United States and around the world. You know, there was a time when the United States, as the first country to institutionalize church-state separation and freedom of thought and belief in our Constitution, we could speak with some credibility about freedom of religion. We had some moral authority on the subject. Just 2 generations ago, President John F. Kennedy spoke of absolute separation of church and state. He promised to uphold the secular firewall that protects all people from religious tyranny by ensuring that our right to believe or not believe whatever we want is upheld. With Donald Trump, we now have a president who openly mocks that fundamental bulwark of religious liberty, and his second administration has engaged in a string of unprecedented, horrific theocratic actions. This administration deplores true religious freedom. They are relentlessly chipping away at the wall of separation between church and state, stripping away rights in the name of religion, and injecting overt Christian nationalism into our public institutions and policies like nothing America has ever seen. Trump has issued executive orders that attempt to provide special treatment for religious organizations. He's appointed judges specifically to advance a Christian nationalist agenda, and his administration is working to systematically dismantle basic freedoms and human rights from the top down. Republicans in Congress who could stop him if they had the courage and integrity are either turning a blind eye or, in many cases, gleefully cheering him on. Your report shows that all of this is not happening in a vacuum. We're seeing here, under Trump, the same thing that is happening globally. It's a disturbing trend. And it should come as no surprise to anyone who has studied the close connection between religious extremism and authoritarianism throughout history. Right now, far-right leaders around the world are weaponizing religion to suppress individual freedoms, to silence opposition, and to advance their own political agendas, and also to enrich themselves in many cases. Humanists and atheists are falling victim to this suppression at higher numbers every year. Blasphemy laws are getting enacted and strengthened in governments across Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Europe, meaning people are facing imprisonment and persecution simply for expressing their religious views. This is a really challenging problem to tackle, but that is exactly why your report is so vital. Thanks to your work, we have the tools and resources to back us up as we take steps to address these issues in Congress. This research gives us a roadmap to identify how religious freedom is changing across the globe, where the most severe threats are, and how we can shape the most effective policies. In a free society, no one should have to hide what they believe or fear punishment for thinking differently. Freedom of religion does not exist without freedom for non-religious people too. It must protect everyone. And when governments grant special status to certain religious groups while marginalizing others, they betray our most fundamental human rights. And we're already seeing that on the ground here in the United States. This report should serve as a wake-up call. History has taught us that when governments start fusing politics with religion and policing religious thought and imposing religion on others, these are just the first bricks to fall. And that's why in the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, which I founded and co-chair, we're taking action. We're pushing back against discriminatory religious exemptions. We are protecting the separation of church and state. We're fighting to maintain religious freedom for all people in this country and spreading awareness of what Trump is doing behind the scenes. And our numbers are growing. The Free Thought Caucus has doubled in size in just the past couple of years. We couldn't do any of this alone. Your research provides the global context and the evidence to back up our fight, and your advocacy amplifies what we are doing here in Congress. So thank you for your partnership, for your unwavering commitment to this work. I know that together we can make a real difference for people across the globe. Thank you.
Well, I think those three contributions give an excellent frame for what we're about to talk about next. So over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes, I will try to convey to you a condensed version of some of the findings of this year's Freedom of Thought report. The Freedom of Thought report, as you know, is a worldwide survey that assesses every country in the world and particularly looks at the treatment of humanists and other non-religious people. I think before I begin this presentation, I also want to make a massive call out and thank you to two people who can't again be here with us tonight but are watching online. That is Nick Bull, the editor of the Freedom of Thought report, and Celine Gray, the research coordinator. Their tireless work all around the year to make sure that the Freedom of Thought report is updated and available online 24/7. As you can see from the copy that you've just been given, this is a short summary of 10 country entries and updates that have happened over the past year. So you can imagine what the full report would look like, and you can understand why we don't print that off. So yeah, just a massive, massive thank you to Nick and Celine. So to talk about the report then, the Freedom of Thought report was first produced in 2012, meaning that we're on our 14th edition. And it was first put together as a piece of work with two or three humanist organizations in the United States. It focuses on international standards of human rights that most affect non-religious people, namely the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion or belief, the right to freedom of expression, and the rights to freedom of assembly and association. Laws and practices affecting the non-religious frequently impact different religious groups, particularly religious minorities. Therefore, in assessing freedom of religion or belief, which I'll refer to in the shorthand as FORB, in different countries throughout the world, we also consider the impact of discriminatory laws and practices on different religious groups. The Freedom of Thought report examines national laws that compromise or violate rights or that enable discrimination. The report specifically captures and documents instances of discrimination by state authorities. It looks at education system and children's rights in each country. It explores the conditions that affect family, society and community, and it also assesses the extent to which freedom of expression and expression of humanist values is possible. Our research year after year finds that the overwhelming majority of countries fail to respect rights of humanists and non-religious people. Any rights violations and discrimination is important, even when only a small number of people are affected. However, the non-religious are not a small group. Those who consider them to be non-religious constitute a large and growing population in the world. Now to talk about the report's online version. So the Freedom of Thought report is primarily an online tool. You can access it here at the website, and you can review it all throughout the year. As I said, this year's updates, this is just a small snapshot of this year's country updates, so you can view the full updates at any time available on the Freedom of Thought report website. So turning now to this Key Countries edition. This Key Countries edition, as I said, is a snapshot of notable developments since the country was last updated. The Key Countries edition comprises 10 countries and a watch list. The countries selected for the Key Countries edition have been chosen to reflect geographical representation, showcase the research conducted by our member organisations, without whom this report would not be possible, and where we can, to highlight concerns and instances of discrimination. This year's Key Countries edition features 10 country entries: Bangladesh, El Salvador, Georgia, Kenya, Malaysia, Malta, Myanmar, Sudan, and the United States. All of the other country updates for this year, as I said, are available to view online. Moving next to look at the theme, Humanists International believes in democracy, the right to freedom of religion or belief, and the right to freedom of expression. We strive to ensure that every person, wherever they may be in the world, is respected and can live with dignity. As found by Freedom House, global freedom has steadily declined for the past 20 years, and also as Naz mentioned in her remarks, with more countries experiencing a deterioration in political rights and civil liberties. In addition, human rights organisations across the world have been targeted, discredited, had funding cut, and many have had to close altogether. There has also been a significant increase in far-right movements across the world, with many taking power in countries which were once considered to be bastions of democracy and freedom. The theme of the 2025 Key Countries edition is the right to freedom of religion or belief in a world of rising authoritarianism. As disinformation and misinformation has grown exponentially in the media, populism has emerged as a political force. Populist politicians have entered government in countries across the globe, laying blame for poor economic conditions on minorities and immigrants. An often overlooked element in the political shift that we are witnessing is that far-right governments and populist movements are increasingly utilising religion as a political tool to advance their ambitions to justify curtailing freedoms. This is often undertaken in the guise of protecting religious freedoms of one religious group at the expense of another. They may present themselves, as has previously been mentioned, as defenders of religious freedom or, quote, traditional values, but in practice what they're pushing is for religious privilege. Moving on to the next section, we'll look at the boundary conditions. Every country in the report is assessed against a range of boundary conditions. The boundary conditions are statements which may or may not apply to each country. Each boundary condition is associated with one of 4 thematic strands. Those are constitution and government, education and children's rights, family, community, society, religious courts and tribunals, and finally, freedom of expression and advocacy of humanist values. Going on now to look at the rating system. In the rating system, each boundary condition is placed at a given level of severity. Only the boundary conditions which are found to apply in a given country are shown in that country's rating table. A signal light summary system also sits along the title of each country on its individual page. Omission of a boundary condition in the ratings box does not necessarily mean that condition does not hold in reality. There are a few important considerations to keep in mind. The lack of transparency in some countries makes the comprehensive analysis of those countries more difficult. In some countries, usually the worst offenders, the secrecy of courts or state media control or lack of reporting make it impossible to produce a complete account. In some countries, vague laws or broad legal powers delegated to local authorities make it difficult to ascertain exactly how these laws are applied in reality. Moving on, we look at the boundary conditions for each country are also reflected in the colouring that you see on the maps. The maps colour each country by the level of the most severe boundary condition applied in each thematic strand. There may be multiple boundary conditions that apply in one country and only a few in another. There may also be some boundary conditions that apply that demonstrate that a country is free and equal. However, if a boundary condition that is more severe is found, then it will supersede the free and equal boundary condition. The ratings take into consideration all the boundaries that apply. Therefore, there may be more boundary conditions in one country than in another. But I think the important thing to say at this stage is each country is assessed in its own merits and on its own terms. So I would really encourage you to check the full report, which you can access at the Freedom of Thought Report website. Moving on now to talk about the watch list. The watch list shows countries that are of concern to Humanists International in terms of FORB and the persecution of the non-religious. Those are countries that have not been updated in this current year, but we think it's important to identify and monitor. For example, as has been mentioned, in Afghanistan, blasphemy and apostasy have recently become punishable by death, now that a system of Sharia law is now in place. These laws and the accompanying social norms imposed by the Taliban leave no space for non-belief, even in private. Many non-religious Afghans have been forced into the total concealment of their belief or have fled the country, while those who remain live in fear. Okay, and we'll now move on to talk a little bit about the current state of the world in terms of freedom of religion or belief, a bit of a snapshot. So, as it stands at the moment, there are 65 countries around the world in which you could be imprisoned for so-called blasphemy. State legislation is largely or entirely derived from religious law or religious authorities in 15 countries. The expression of core humanist principles on democracy, freedom, or human rights is severely or brutally restricted in 67 countries. Religious or ideological instruction is mandatory in all or most state-funded schools with no secular or humanist alternative in 32 countries. Now we're going to go on to look at some summary of the 10 countries which have been included in the Key Countries edition for this year. Now, by its nature, obviously, this presentation will be summary. We have time in the panel discussion later to get into some more detail and any questions if anybody has. So yes, please excuse the brevity here. Okay, so the first country that we will look at is Bangladesh. The former Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's increasingly authoritarian regime became characterised by the harassment and arbitrary arrest of activists, crackdowns on protests, and the use of enforced disappearance against her opponents. With repressive laws including the abusive Digital Security Act and Cyber Security Act, which it replaced, the former government used its power to silence and criminalise freedom of expression and FORB. After the government was removed from power, the country is now going through a transition period, with elections having taken place only a couple of weeks ago. The recent election will shape Bangladesh's future and how the country adapts after a climate of fear under the previous regime. Proposed reforms will determine how quickly the country can respond to its recent history. Moving on next to talk about El Salvador. Since coming to power, President Bukele has declared a national emergency. This national emergency, which started in 2022, has been reviewed and renewed and remains in place at this time. The government has used that state of emergency to justify the arbitrary detention of human rights defenders, and in June 2025, Bukele's party brought into force a new foreign agents law. The new law has been widely condemned by human rights groups and international observers as a deliberate attempt to control, silence, and punish civil society and those critical of the government. Next on to Georgia. In Georgia, the constitution and government policy defer a special status and privileges to the Greek Orthodox Church, the GOC. Meanwhile, negative attitudes towards the non-religious in Georgia are reported and higher than any other religious group. Amid the 2024 parliamentary elections, the Georgian Dream-led government rallied against human rights, civil society, and the West in the name of protecting the GOC's traditions and, quote, family values. Human rights defenders have faced legal charges. Civil society has experienced continuous harassment, with many having little option but to escape the country. Next, we will look at Kenya. In 2010, Kenya adopted a constitution that declares that there is no state religion and that the state shall be religiously neutral. The right to FORB is enshrined in Article 32. In 2016, Atheists in Kenya Society, which is a member of Humanists International, became the first non-religious society to be registered under the Societies Act after initially being rejected. However, there have been repeated legal attempts to revoke the organisation's registration by religious groups. Legal proceedings have ruled in favour of Atheists in Kenya Society, determining that holding non-theistic or atheistic views is protected under the Constitution. Kenya has a large and active civil society sector. However, NGOs have periodically faced regulatory pressure and targeting, including deregistration threats for alleged non-compliance with financial reporting and governance requirements. Moving on now to Lebanon. In Lebanon, all government and parliamentary seats are exclusively divided according to the sectarian governance model, and citizens who do not belong to a religious group are effectively excluded from political representation, or indeed from holding any public office. In 2021, a survey conducted by Free Thought Lebanon, again a member of Humanists International, concluded that 73% of atheists residing in the country felt that they were treated unfairly by Lebanese personnel status laws, and over 80% felt that Lebanese educational institutions instigate or incite hatred against atheists. Furthermore, 71% felt that their atheism or their expression thereof might cause them legal problems, and 90% have practiced self-censorship on their views to avoid social or legal consequences. It is also common that atheists are portrayed as, quote, immoral, untrustworthy, or are labelled as foreign agents. The Lebanese Penal Code contains 3 articles that criminalise, quote, blaspheming God publicly, the most severe punishment being 3 years in prison. Now on to Malaysia. In 2023, a stand-up comedian was fined $1,800 under Section 298 of Malaysia's Penal Code. The penalty followed a 2022 comedy performance in which the comedian removed her headscarf on stage. Her husband was also fined for posting a video of her performance online. Offences relating to religion are outlined in Malaysia's Penal Code. Convictions can result in prison sentences of up to 2 years or a fine. Prison terms can be increased up to 20 years if there is a physical harm or damage to property. Now on to Malta. Malta has historically been seen as leading the way on LGBTI plus legal rights globally. Discrimination based on sexual orientation was legalised in 2014, same-sex marriage in 2017. While there haven't been any significant societal actions against the non-religious found in Malta, the prevalence of Roman Catholicism doctrine in the country has resulted in many young people remaining underinformed about safe-sex, sexual relationships and sexual orientation. There is also a continuing level of patriarchal and misogynistic attitudes to women that persist in a traditionally religious society. On to Myanmar. In Myanmar, the constitution prohibits, quote, the abuse of religion for political purposes. The government has, however, favoured Theravada Buddhism through official propaganda and state support, including donations for monasteries and pagodas. The persecutions of Muslims in Myanmar has been most severe in the case of the Rohingya community, and the International Criminal Court has requested an arrest warrant for a senior member of the army. In 2022, a law enacted by the military junta provides a penalty of up to 5 years in prison for organisations that fail to register with the government. However, countless civil society organisations have chosen not to do so, as to do so would require them to declare information that could put them at severe risk. Now on to the penultimate entry for Sudan. In 2020, the transitional government signed a declaration adopting the principle of secularism. However, in 2021, the SAF forces seized power, dissolving the transitional government and arresting civilian leaders. Sudan is now caught up in another civil war between rival factions. As of early 2026, the Sudan portal of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reported 11 million people had been forcibly displaced since the conflict began. There have been a series of attacks on religious sites, including the bombing of churches and mosques. Religious discrimination also remains prevalent in Sudan, as many laws concerning personal and family affairs adopted during al-Bashir's rule remain largely intact. There's also been an increasing level of attacks on human rights groups, including women human rights defenders in particular, since the start of the conflict. And now we will look at the final entry, which is covered in this year's Key Countries edition, which is the United States. As Congressman Huffman actually mentioned, the United States, with its First Amendment provisions, has historically received a very positive score from the Freedom of Thought report. This is because that most of the constitutional protections have in practice been applied. However, we can see a change. Now in his second term, President Trump has further deepened his alliance with conservative Christian leaders. He has elevated influential non-denominational evangelical Christian leaders whose beliefs were previously on the fringes and are now accepted as mainstream. The role of non-religious people in the US public service exists within a political environment increasingly dominated by far-right Christian nationalism, championed by the Trump administration. This movement advances a social narrative that links being American with being religious and being specifically Christian. In 2025, President Trump established the Anti-Christian Bias Task Force. The task force is charged with investigating and eradicating anti-Christian targeting and discrimination within federal government agencies, and has the stated aim to, quote, fully prosecute anti-Christian violence and vandalism. The US is not, however, a Christian nation. The First Amendment requires strict separation of religion and government, reflecting the founders' understanding of America as a pluralistic nation, even as far back as the 18th century. Throughout the country, states have enacted restrictive censorship laws that prohibit Americans access to library books and resources. These laws force libraries to satisfy the religious, ideological, and partisan preferences of a vocal minority. The US has also taken steps to withdraw from multilateral forums. In February 2025, an order was given to disengage from the UN Human Rights Council and to review or cut funding to UN agencies. That was a very quick overview of some of this year's key country edition updates. I'm now going to just leave you with some thoughts on the emerging themes and trends that we can see from this year's report before we move on to the panel discussion. So in terms of regulation, monitoring and control of civil society, this is a theme that will, I'm sure, resonate with lots of NGOs around the world. Authorities' efforts to regulate, monitor and control civil society are found in a number of different countries. We've mentioned, for example, Georgia and El Salvador have both adopted Russian-style foreign agents laws. Hungary is also in the steps of proposing to make such a law. As I mentioned, in Myanmar, organisations must register with the military junta, reveal the names and addresses of people involved with the organisation. And I obviously mentioned the struggles in Kenya with the Atheists in Kenya Society being placed under legal challenge. In terms of arbitrary laws and repressive laws, there's a number of countries that have used or created laws to restrict freedom of expression. These can take many times the names of cybersecurity laws or digital laws, but in effect and in practice, they operate like blasphemy laws. I also mentioned as well the states of emergency. You know, we spoke about the El Salvador, Myanmar situation where governments ramp up a state of emergency rhetoric in order to allow them the political leverage to pass restrictive laws which can affect humanists and the promotion of humanist values. In terms of religious rhetoric, again, we've seen from many reports this year the use of religious nationalism, a conflation of religious identity with, of national identity with religious identity, and the promotion of a nationalistic agenda. So we can see a number of different themes, I think, which emerge throughout this year's Key Countries edition. So it's a pretty stark picture that we find ourselves in now, but thank you for bearing with me for the presentation of this year's findings. And I'll now invite the panelists to join me up here to discuss it further. Sorry, one second. We're just actually going to have one more video presentation from another person who couldn't be with us today. So the person who wrote the introduction to this year's Freedom of Thought report, the former president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria, Mubarak Bala. Okay, I think we're having some technical problems, so we'll make sure that we share Mubarak's contribution online afterwards for everybody to see. So if we can move on now to the panel discussion, and if I can invite the panelists to join me up here. Ellis.
Is this working?
Okay, thank you everybody. So myself and Maggie are joined here on the panel by Ellis Mathews, who is the head of the Human Rights Division at the European External Action Service, as well as Leon Langdon, the Senior Advocacy Officer at Humanists International. So if we can please welcome them. Thank you so much. And I think we have around 20, 25 minutes for our discussion, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. I guess maybe Ellis, if I can put you on the spot first of all. Obviously, you've seen the report. I know that you've aware of the report previously. I don't know if you can give us on behalf of EAS maybe an initial response or any thoughts to the report.
Sure. Perhaps I can sort of rudely also take advantage of this occasion. Well, first of all, hopefully not so rudely, to thank you for inviting us. But secondly, to say congratulations on the report. It's a great resource. I think the Congressman and others made that point very nicely. Fantastically well researched, and you've really got global coverage there. So that's fantastic. And then I was going to say, perhaps self-interestedly take advantage of the opportunity actually possibly to explain what the freedom of religion or belief dimension of EU human rights policy actually is, because I think that would be I think useful. A lot of it obviously is in the continuity of the comments that were made in the introductory speeches, including your own. But I want to emphasize that the way that we look at this is really very much consonant with the way that you set out the problem in the prefatory remarks to the report. So basically the way that EU policy works on this, I'll come on to that, how that's structured in a moment, is that it's freedom of religion or belief for all, and we very much subscribe to what the Special Rapporteur said, which is based on the sources of international law, which is that is cast very wide, so it includes people who have atheistic beliefs or people who choose to have no system of belief. So that's very important. And I should also say that it goes very much hand in hand with freedom of expression. So it has equal value. And we express this in the contributions that we've made to resolutions at the UN level, at the General Assembly, at the Human Rights Council, that again derive from the legal text that you and your colleagues referred to. And together with that, we consistently condemn across the board globally, but also in particular countries where it may occur, advocacy of religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, intolerance, violence, persecution. And so the way that we express that is through a set of guidelines that were adopted by the Council. That means that they bind the EU institutions, ourselves, the Commission colleagues, but also the Member States in the way that we operate human rights policy, and not just at a kind of declaratory or normative level through the multilateral system, but also what we say bilaterally and through EU delegations in country, and also how we program the instruments of assistance that we have. And I want to say, therefore, that not only do those guidelines have kind of practical guidance for what you do if you're a political officer in an EU delegation and you encounter violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief, but they also very clearly set out some of the things that were, I think, also clearly said and illustrated in your report, that there is a very close link, obviously, to freedom of expression, which I mentioned, but also freedom of association, to equality and non-discrimination, sometimes to issues like the death penalty. And the guidelines then set out the kind of situations that you might encounter in countries. So manifestations of violence, infringements of freedom of expression, the need to support respect for diversity, the anti-discrimination agenda, as I mentioned, but also, very importantly, you mentioned this, and you're an expression of this, the involvement of civil society. And that's why we have consistently promoted and will continue to promote in the Human Rights Council session that has just begun this pairing of resolutions that we have, where we have an agreement with the wider UN membership on a consensus basis, also very importantly with the Organization of Islamic Countries, which puts together the successively renewed resolution on freedom of religion or belief, which contains all the principles that we've collectively just elucidated, but also the one on combating religious intolerance, which is also very importantly, I'm not sure whether I'm choosing the right word here, agnostic in terms of the religions that it's talking about. So it's talking about discussion and promotion of, for want of a better word, harmony between people of all faiths and no faith, and how that then applies. So just then to say that we then use that policy framework to promote targeted programs that fight discrimination. Our INPA colleagues do this, the Commission through projects in Asia and Africa. They're aimed at increasing public awareness, improving recognition of the rights that we've discussed, strengthening civil society and institutions, combating discriminatory practices, and we can get onto this, but obviously if people are facing discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief, they would also qualify for assistance under some of the programs that we have that support civil society, or indeed that aim to protect individual human rights defenders. So just to try and give that picture and then make the link back to the report, which is that we very much draw on sources such as your report when it comes to attaching examples to that broader policy framework. And then because I think you said it, but it bears repetition, what often happens is that it isn't only the right to freedom of religion or belief that is violated. This comes as part of a much wider repression of rights, but we would consistently raise this then in what we say about particular countries as their cases come before the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly of the UN, or indeed in the bilateral human rights dialogues, 40 or more that the EU has with individual countries around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellis. I wonder if I could come to Leon now. Leon, obviously you lead Humanists International's work at the United Nations and our advocacy work. I'm just thinking that the report this year focuses on how governments are increasingly weaponizing religion to justify repression and undermine human rights. In your opinion, what extent or how do you think religious nationalism impacts and operates on things that affect democracy and human rights?
I think there's two elements to it that are interesting. One is the use of religion, and the other is actually the use of human rights language and the human rights framework. I think a lot of our speakers tonight have already spoken about the use of religion, the use of religious nationalism, the use of Christian nationalism or Hindutva in parts of the world to sort of support governments and to inherently put forward an exclusionary idea of who should be involved in the public polity, of who should be involved in democracy and citizenship, of having those sort of exclusionary narratives. The arguably more insidious part of that is when we see governments, state actors, or even civil society using the human rights lens of that, so the right to freedom of religion or belief, and putting forward an exclusionary narrative of that, using it to justify, for example, pro-life or anti-abortion commentary, putting forward, for example, restrictions on, again, who can participate in democracy, who can participate in public life, for example, LGBTQ plus persons, and then, of course, as we've seen in many of our examples, the non-religious. So I think there's those two kind of sides of it there.
Thanks, Leon. Maggie, do you have any thoughts for us to share with us?
Well, so I hope this is on. Is this on? When you highlighted the fact that the United States had not really been a part of this report as a country of concern, I just had this wave of embarrassment and shame, and I apologize for that on behalf of half of the United States who do oppose what's happening under the Trump administration and are finding ways in which to resist and finding ways to use the rule of law to speak out against what's happening, against rising authoritarianism and isolationism and discrimination against, not just atheists and humanists and free thinkers, but immigrants, women, LGBTQ plus people. I want to emphasize, I think, the importance of allyship and community at this time, ways in which we can continue to promote and work towards our shared values and our shared aims. I think that there's a lot that we can learn, again, from the history of Europe in particular. But I also think we can learn from how we've built communities in countries, across the world. So I understand that the United States needed to be a part of this report. And what it means, I think, for humanist organizations and atheist organizations in the United States is that we're going to need to work even harder to hopefully turn things back around and make things better for our communities and other communities that are suffering under this administration.
Thanks, Maggie. Another question, or one of the themes that came out of the report, which, Ellis, I wonder if we could ask for your thoughts on, is this idea of how human rights defenders are increasingly being labelled as enemies, foreign agents, blasphemers. We gave the example of in Georgia, rallying against human rights, quote, the West, protection of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Georgian Orthodox Church and family values. When we think about this idea, the vilification of human rights defenders, what is perhaps European law and policy doing to protect those human rights defenders?
Sure. Can I abuse of your indulgence to perhaps offer some comments on the previous interventions as well? Because I think that would be, I think you're onto something when you link together various phenomena that are broadly part of a pushback against the rule of law and democratic values, including at the global level. And so I think we're not, the way that we express our policy isn't telling other countries what system of government they need to have, but it is pointing out that religion or the lack of it isn't the business of the state. That's for self-initiating religious organisations to deal with, but it is the business of the state to be the duty bearer in terms of protecting the rights of its citizens, including obviously the right of to hold or not a religion or a belief system, and so I think we see then also in the bilateral contacts that we have with countries, but also in the multilateral system, we see the effects of identitarian politics, culture wars. And that's why I think we're very attached to, and I think it has more than just symbolic meaning, as I said, the pairing of those two resolutions that I mentioned in both the Geneva and the New York setting, because we specifically want to be, deconflicting and diminishing geopolitical tensions, especially not letting them take a religious form. So we think that's actually quite important. But I think we also have to be aware that there is a lot of money going into lobbying in national and multilateral systems, which is coming from people of faith. It's often pushing, or let's call it religious organizations. It's pushing back against gender and sexual and reproductive health and rights. And it is either actively or implicitly collusive between different sources of funding, and one that includes North America, includes the Gulf, and so we need to be aware that that's going on in a very organised and well-funded way in the background. And in fact, Volker Turk, who was also referred to by the special rapporteur, has talked about this extensively, including in the good speech that he gave at the EU NGO Forum on human rights last December here in Brussels. So on your specific civil society question, so we are absolutely convinced that civil society is essential to build peaceful, just and inclusive societies. That's why we've worked with the Commission on the civil society strategy that they've just adopted in November, December last, but which has also got an international dimension, because we think that civil society, and your report is proof of this, you're essential watchdogs and part of the checks and balances inside healthy democracies, hopefully also in countries that aspire to be helpful and healthy democracies. And so, promoting a safe and enabling civic space is very much part of our action plan on human rights and democracy. When it comes to human rights defenders, as I said, the definition is very broad. It would include people who are motivated by the desire to promote and protect the particular rights that we're talking about today, but it also includes others that you mention. It could be journalists, it could be indigenous peoples or others who are campaigning on environmental grounds, but basically we condemn threats and attacks against them. We intervene with governments bilaterally and multilaterally when people are under threat. We use actions in our, as I said, public diplomacy, trial observation, public campaigns, the contacts and travel of the EU Special Representative on human rights, and we have a specific human rights defenders mechanism, Protect Defenders EU, which then can intervene and help individuals if, for instance, they've been deprived of their livelihoods through discrimination or repression, or indeed can, in some extreme circumstances, help bring them to a place of safety if they're under threat of, in terms of their lives or well-being.
Thanks, Ellis. Does anybody like to make a comment? No. Perhaps I could ask another question then, maybe to broaden it out a little bit. We've touched on the United States a few times, and I think, you know, one of the elephants in the room is just the changing geopolitical order that we find ourselves in the world. And, you know, the US has had many traditional democratic allies, such as here in Europe. It's also been a major supporter and funder of NGOs around the world through USAID and the State Department. Indeed, this Freedom of Thought report, the first edition in 2012, was facilitated in part by the State Department and Maggie back in 2012, who helped us get it off the ground. Obviously, with the change in US policy and some of the concerns that we've highlighted in the report, many states, the European Union, I think, and many NGOs are reviewing their engagement and their collaboration with the United States government and its policy. This obviously is a big change. And
we're very sorry, by the way. I just want to be clear, very sorry.
But it does, I mean, it poses a very significant question of how do we navigate our relationship with what is still the preeminent superpower in the world as it goes through this major shift in foreign policy and power. How do we do that as an NGO? How do you do that as the European Union? Who wants to have a stab at that first?
Yeah, I'll only mention that again. I do want to remind folks that half of the country, so think one half, there's one side, and then there's another half, that are more than willing to work with our allies in Europe and around the world. And we're trying really hard. Again, you know, we have opposed the defunding of USAID and the UN and all of these withdrawals that the US have done. And we have spoken out. There have been very brave journalists who have spoken out and talked about real stories of real Americans who have been affected by these changes. Those stories, I think, will make a huge difference. But again, you know, just through our work at Humanists International and other NGOs that are based in the United States and work largely with other countries, we're still doing that work. It's really important, and we do it at a risk. You know, again, as I sit up here, I recognize the things that I'm saying right now hopefully will not prevent me from the opportunity to go home tomorrow. I fly home tomorrow to Washington, D.C., and I live in Washington, D.C. I know sometimes that sounds a little extreme, but we are living in unprecedented times in the United States. And it's taking some time for people to recognize what needs to be done and the way in which these policies have affected people's everyday lives. But we are getting there, and I think we will see, hopefully, some changes happening in our upcoming midterm elections in November, because people are fed up with this administration. They're fed up with seeing the erosion of their rights, seeing this rising authoritarianism. And I'm really proud, again, of half the country, and hopefully that'll be more, who will do their part to protect our Constitution and protect our freedoms.
I think when it comes to Forbes specifically and the US, I think what the EU has done in the past, particularly on the dual resolutions that Ellis mentioned at the UN, I think when there has been difficulty with sort of the winds of change geopolitically, the EU has been strong on Forbes, and I think that is really admirable. And I think the honest truth is countries need to be louder and need to be stronger when it comes to speaking up for human rights. I think the tariffs, the trade, all of these issues are things that are obviously countries and the European Union, but member states themselves sort of separately, as well as countries around the world, are obviously worried and they're afraid about all of these things. But ultimately, the countries who have stood up for human rights, for the right to freedom of religion or belief, who have been supporters of civil society, as we've just talked about, I think it is incredibly important that they keep that work going, that they keep that steadfast work going, and that they don't necessarily start to decouple human rights from trade issues, from other issues, because they ultimately remain central to all of the work that civil society is doing, but all of the progress that has been made for however many years you want to mention in terms of progress on human rights. And sometimes when I think about my job, I think it would have been a lot more fun to do my job 20 years ago or 30 years ago, where you were sort of pushing forward human rights and exploring new areas. And so much of what we do now is sort of defend what we've already won, and we defend the positions that have been won. But I think ultimately having states and multilateral coalitions or bodies like the European Union stand up and defend those rights, and also defend human rights defenders, the people who do that work on the ground, I think is incredibly important.
Thanks, Leon. Ellis, can we invite you to comment on relationship with the United States?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I don't think you would expect us to be running, as a matter of our foreign policy, a kind of daily commentary on what's going on inside the US. But I do think that certainly the most powerful dimension of that in democracy is the internal checks and balances of the US itself. And Maggie referred to that, and Congressman Huffman referred to that as well. So I think that's definitely the first line. I mean, the way that we're positioned is that we will continue to work with the US where we can, and there are still considerable areas of agreement across these kinds of issues. But I think we will also make sure that we steer a course which is based on us maintaining our principled approach. And I think inherent to what I said previously about the approach that we have is that we try not to give ground to religion as a means of introducing cultural or other exceptionalism to the universality of human rights. So we would apply our approach across the globe for everybody in all the situations that we might encounter, as was said, I think from the very beginning. So that would be an important dimension, and I think that even-handedness would then be the basis of maintaining a wide, cross-regional global agreement on what the norms are internationally, in terms of a consensus that then in different political times other partners might be able to rejoin. So I think that's the basic approach that we're likely to have. So just to take a particular example, there's no reason why we shouldn't speak out about the persecution of Christians in certain circumstances, but we wouldn't be in a situation where we were only talking about the rights of the holders of one religion.
Thanks, Ellis. That's very helpful. We're going to move very shortly to audience questions. And afterwards, for the people in the room, there will be a nice cold glass of Prosecco available. So I know it's quite warm in here, but that's something to bear in mind. And folks at home, I recommend to get a beverage of your own choice. Before we do that, though, I wonder if we could just go down the panel, starting with Leon down this way, maybe just with a quick summary of thoughts from the panelists. So perhaps you could think about, what's the one takeaway from the report launched today, or maybe in Leon's case, what would be one recommendation, or what would be some recommendations you would have for policymakers?
I'm going to be cheeky and take the opportunity to say two things. The first is, I think blasphemy laws came up in so many of the countries that you presented. And when we think about blasphemy laws, we think about countries like Myanmar and Kenya that were mentioned in the report, but so many European countries still have blasphemy laws. So many countries that we don't immediately think about that have so-called dead letter laws. Gary and I had a great conversation with Mubarak Bala the other day, whose video unfortunately isn't working, but for those, he would have introduced himself, but for those unfamiliar, Mubarak was sentenced to 24 years in prison in Nigeria for blasphemy, and he spent about 4 or 5 years of those 4 or 5 years in prison before we worked to get him out. He spoke to us and he mentioned that while he was in prison, it was pointing to European blasphemy laws where it was one of the justifications used by prison guards who were persecuting him, who were talking about it's okay that Nigeria, where he was imprisoned, had a blasphemy law because of the laws in European countries. And so I think when we look at countries like Germany and Austria, I think off the top of my head, for example, both still have laws that are either blasphemy or de facto blasphemy laws. They are things that even if they're not enforced in those countries in any meaningful way, they need to be worked to be taken off the books, as well as obviously blasphemy laws in the 60 plus countries where you can be imprisoned for it around the world. And then I think my other takeaway, much more briefly, is that for all of those institutions, stakeholders, NGOs, to be forwarding an inclusive right to FORB, as Ellis just said, to be talking about the persecution of Christians, to be talking about the persecution of different groups, but never solely any of those groups, to also be speaking out about the instrumentalization or the misuse of the right to freedom of religion or belief or religion in either of its manifestations, and to be in forwarding that inclusive vision of the right to freedom of religion or belief that includes LGBTQ plus persons, that is considerate of the gender dimension and women's rights, and is obviously inclusive of the non-religious.
Thanks, Leon. Ellis, your final thoughts, takeaways?
Yeah, I guess the connection I made in my mind is that you were taking a number of examples in terms of the countries that you mentioned, of countries that have either gone through or are still going through a significant political transition, or indeed countries where the European Union would be wanting to contribute to the basis of a lasting and just peace for the people of that country, and linked in my mind also to, I think, an important debate that we've been having at the EU level, and in fact it so happens that Volker Turk was at the January Foreign Affairs Council talking to the EU foreign ministers about this, and that's the importance, and now I'm talking beyond just freedom of religion or belief, but the importance of looking at human rights as integral to what we do on peace and security, and bearing in mind that failure to uphold human rights isn't just a consequence of conflict, it's actually a cause of conflict. So I guess my mind was very much drawn to some of the examples that you picked out. One would be Bangladesh, another would be Syria, and there I think in the way that we interact with the authorities in those two countries, we really have a responsibility to try to promote the rule of law, human rights, and freedom of religion or belief in that context. So hopefully to help them be more stable and democratic societies in the future. But I'm thinking also of so far unresolved conflicts which have sometimes had a religious dimension, like Sudan, where you want to make sure that the resolution of the conflict also goes through making sure that basic rights and grounds that have been used as attempted justifications for violence or discrimination don't repeat then again in the future. So I guess those were some of the thoughts that that the report set going in my mind.
Thanks, Ellis. Maggie?
Yeah, I just want to again thank the folks who are in the room who represent member organizations of Humanists International and those who are online representing their organizations. Just thank you as always for contributing to this report and continuing to strengthen it year after year. Again, this is a really critical tool for our member organizations to take to their government officials and to other allies and to other groups. So just thank you all. It takes a lot of effort to put this report together, and just very grateful to Humanists International. And please don't take democracy for granted, as we learned in the United States.
Okay, now it's your turn to ask us some questions. So we've got Jonas, our lovely European advocacy officer at the back. He will take maybe 2 or 3 questions at a time. If you can, please tell us your name and any affiliation, just so that it helps us understand who's in the room. So hands up if anybody would like to ask a question. We've got one at the back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Robert Glieke. I'm an emeritus professor in anthropology and social biology. I wrote a big book on evolution science and ethics. In the paper, the invitation, and in the speeches of several panelists, I have heard the terms religion or belief. That sounds to me very redundant. Belief is, in my ears, religious belief. And it is usually the case that non-believer, non-religious people are called in very negative terms. Atheist is a nice example, non-believers and so on. So I think that in some other languages we have very good terms to indicate the worldview of people. For instance, in Dutch, my language, Lebensbeschouwing, in German, Weltanschauung, in French, Philosophie de vie. So there are in other languages terms which are better than not believers or non-believers. In English, I think the best that I found is worldview. Wouldn't be better that the Humanists International would use in the future the term worldview, which covers religious and non-religious people, and more particularly the non-religious people are not believers. Their views very often are based on knowledge, scientific knowledge, social knowledge. So we really should change this very negative approach towards non-religious people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions at this time? Got one over here and then one in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Rachel Forster. I work for Search for Common Ground. We're a peace-building organisation, but we work on freedom of religion or belief in settings which are either actively in conflict or in early stages where we see conflict rising, or actually in post-conflict settings. And so I was very heartened by what you said earlier about sort of the human rights, including FORB aspect, as essential to peace and security. I think that's something that is very relevant and that we see every day in the work that we do. I had a question. What we heard was obviously very dark. There's a lot of things going wrong in the world on FORB and on many number of issues, but I'd be really interested if in your report you came across any bright spots, any improvements that you've seen that we also can learn from. And I'm thinking of this particularly because I also work a lot on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, where obviously the anti-gender backlash discussions come up again and again. But what has been useful is hearing from partners and colleagues who work in very restricted spaces, how they in the past have countered these narratives and movements. And I think we can learn a lot from even the little bits of progress that are being made. So I'm sure that there are a candle flickering in the dark somewhere that you could share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Mila Pospolanova, I'm the Anti-Racial Discrimination Advisor for Europe with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I wanted to ask you about your reading on I cannot see all the countries, but it's very notorious, the example of Russia, for example. What happens between quite good rating that they have, it appears in green, on the indicators related to education and children's rights, everything seems good, and then we see the deterioration in all other aspects. And in some other countries we can see this as well. I see also the example of Mexico, there is the example of Brazil here. So what's your reading on this, and what can we do with this data that you have here on this big disconnect that we have between education, children, and then the next stages? And also to recognize your very extensive reference to UN normative framework. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those questions. I'll just have a stab maybe at answering a couple of them and then bring in my panelists here. So in terms of your point about the terminology, freedom of religion or belief, well, I know Leon has some views on this. I have a complicated view on this. I don't disagree with you, and I think the word that we do often use in English is life stance, and I think we borrowed that from the Norwegians, from the Norwegian word. But there are a lot of better words. I like the German word. The reason we use that word is it's a summary of the article in the Universal Declaration, which refers to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. Now, what we are trying to guard against here is the minimization of that to freedom of religion, because that's where we get a lot of these instrumentalization and the elevation of religious rights above all others. So when we use the word FORB, we're specifically talking in a context of human rights treaties, frameworks, advocacy, and things all get very acronym heavy. Now, that is the lay of the land as it stands, and one of our ultimate advocacy goals is to defend the gains that we've made there by the use of the term FORB. As you can hear, in the United States, what they talk about is international religious freedom. And so, one of the things we've been trying to do is to include the belief, because that encompasses people who have non-religious beliefs. And then there is a semantic point to be made about whether a non-religious belief is a belief. But on the point of advocacy, I think we have gained so much there that I think the risk of losing it would be much higher than the benefits to be gained. But when talking in the philosophical sense, I think the use of the word life stance in English is a much better one. And then to comment on the education rankings, the Russian entry in particular is difficult. I mean, one of the reasons for that is that our boundary conditions are essentially things which become triggered. You trigger a boundary condition if the existence of some law or policy is present. Now, it's possible that in the case of Russia that we don't know fully what the situation is, or that the practice, i.e. what would be under education, state discrimination against religion on religious grounds, or religious authorities having a preference in the syllabus, or state funding of religious schools, they may not technically be present. There could be other regressive forces or problematic things applying that don't happen to trigger our boundary conditions. It is one of the aspects of the report is that it's a negativistic report. So countries, as we assess them, countries gather up these negative boundary conditions. Now, if we miss something, or if it slips through the net of our boundary condition, it just doesn't gather the points to be scored negatively, if that makes sense. And of course, if there's any funders out there who would like to help us with more money and research available to help improve the report, would be very, very welcome. But Leon, would you like to comment on some of the questions?
Sure. Just on the gentleman at the back's question, I generally agree with your comments, Gary. We engage in a whole range of fora. At the Council of Europe, we're involved in the interreligious and interconvictional dialogue. With the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we're involved in the Faith for Rights framework. We're not a faith organization. Non-religious people don't have a faith necessarily, but because of this, Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the right to freedom of religion and belief, but also another UN document. There's two. There's the 1981 Declaration, but also I think it's 1992 General Comment. Is very clear. It's an agreement of states, every state at the UN, that this right under Article 18 includes the right to have a non-religious, non-theistic, atheistic belief. And so, as Gary said, this is where Humanists International and previously the International Humanist and Ethical Union has done a lot of its work in the human rights field to defend the non-religious around the world. So we maybe on a personal level and particularly with an anthropological background, I can see the sort of difficulties with that label, but as it pertains to the human rights framework, we're pretty happy once we're engaging with religious colleagues or other kind of non-religious colleagues. I won't probably add any additional comments on the boundary conditions in Russia. On your comment from Search for Common Ground, I actually think the Faith for Rights network that I just mentioned is quite a strong one, and I work with some of your colleagues there. When it comes to individuals on the ground, I think individual peace builders bringing their faith and their belief, and I think it's particularly powerful, and I can talk to you about some individual examples after, but when we see interfaith work ultimately, and particularly where that interfaith work is inclusive of the non-religious, there's plenty of places across Africa where our members are involved in that work, and I think that is where you see either the fruits or at the very least the building blocks of peaceful and just societies, and often, you know, as with Search for Common Ground's work, often arising out of incredibly difficult contexts. And I think the ability to recognize a shared humanity with one another, regardless of faith, regardless of religion or lack thereof, I think is key, and I think many of our members are involved at kind of the front line of that work, and it's a privilege that we're able to sort of support them in that work internationally.
Maggie, Ellis, would you guys like to offer any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think Leon's put it much better than I could, but perhaps just two things. So I very much sympathise with the question about why we can't find a kind of snappier epithet to describe all of this than what we have in the long accretions of international law and precedent. And I think this is something that we fight with a little bit as human rights policymakers and practitioners, that we need to get much more comfortable with ways of talking that put the jargon to one side and really connect better with people. So I'm all in favour of simplifying. I do also think it's important to remember that freedom of religion or belief, it is a shorthand because it also includes thought and conscience. And so it's deriving all the way back from the very fundamental documents, notably the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, but there's been a consistent effort to draw it very widely so that you don't exclude people whose religious faith doesn't express itself through a complicated organisational hierarchy or whatever. And indeed, rightly here the emphasis more on humanistic or non-faith-based approaches. So I fully recognise the need to be able to express ourselves in a direct and readily understandable way if we want to get through. And a second thing I just wanted to echo, because I think it was very important what Leon said, and in fact the EAS has done quite a lot of work on this in the past, so that in terms of developing a more, how should I put it, faith-literate foreign policy. I think it is important that in our relatively secular societies in much of Europe, despite what you said about tendencies in certain European countries, that we recognise that there are quite a lot of people in the world who are motivated by faith to do very important things in terms of civic engagement, contributions to peace processes, and we need to be, recognise the legitimacy of that motivation, be able to engage with those people in some of the situations that we've talked about, in a context where we would want them then to be interacting with everybody of all other faiths and people who don't profess any faith as part of sustainable peace and peace building and prevention initiatives.
Thanks, Ellis. We're now towards the end of our time together. Does anybody on the panel wish to offer any last-minute thoughts or concluding remarks? No, I think everything that could be said has been said very eloquently by you all. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for the folks that are here with us today, and everybody watching online. Thank you for your support for Humanists International and for this important report. And lastly, could you please just join me in giving a big thank you to Ellis, Leon and Maggie for being on our panel today. Thank you so much.